Assalamu alaikum everybody, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to another amazing Saturday session. We are so excited to start a new surah today, Surah Al-Mujadilah, number 58. It's truly an amazing accomplishment when you think about the fact that we have now finished 74 surahs and we're starting our 75th surah. And that number was just so weighty on me, and I was thinking about how far we've come in this year and a half. You know, we have 40 more surahs to do. If people know our history, we have some that were done not by the Project Illumine style, but also the line-by-line traditional style. So when you tally that all up, I think we've done probably 96. I think there are like 18 surahs that have not been touched in either format. But, you know, we are charging forward. And I just have to take a moment. I mean, I reflected about this a little bit on, you know, in my weekly email yesterday, and it just is something that it's like this number and this whole experience has been really like hard to wrap my mind around, because we've reached a point now where, you know, we've got so many videos out. People are finding us. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. It's really exciting. I'm getting more and more email. It's hard for me to keep up to respond because, you know, these are like really beautiful emails where people write about how they found the Project Illumine videos, they've watched them, they've made such an amazing impact on their life. And, you know, a lot of them have just started and just watched a few. But it's like, you know, people then also you find are starting to quote to some of the things that we've talked about here. And, you know, sometimes, most often without attribution. But, you know, we recognize them because we've lived with them and we've been exposed to them, and we know that we've heard them here and not anywhere else. So when we start hearing these things from repeated in other places, you know, in some ways it's like the highest form of flattery, right? Because people are, you know, talking about it and you know, sharing it and imitating it as if it's common knowledge. That's really beautiful. But when you think about the fact that now we've covered 75 surahs, like think about how much work it just takes to understand one surah, if you're even lucky to understand one surah. And the fact that we have now seen before our eyes that this one scholar was able to not just understand these surahs, and, you know, we're charging forward, we're you know, on the road, inshallah, to finishing 114. But in the 74 we've done so far, it's not just an understanding of what's in the surah itself, but all of the stuff that goes around it and into it, and, you know, in understanding what actually this surah says. And so when you start thinking about that entire production in one person's lifetime, and who else has done that and where else can you find that, it's mind-blowing. It's like I start thinking about, you know, we talk a lot about Mozart and, you know, Beethoven, people who can, you know, their brains are wired differently and they can, you know, construct music, and, you know, they're just at that level, and that's what we're experiencing here. And I continue to try and wrap my brain around it because it's so stunning. And at a personal level, like you know, even just like when we started out and we were doing even like, you know, online social media, trying to tell people, hey, you know, watch this, this is really interesting, we're working on the Qur'an, you know, people are like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool. But, you know, no one really had an understanding. And I think the attitude was almost like, hey, you know, trying to convince you we're doing something important, you should check it out, you should watch it. Now I've noticed in myself, after 74 surahs, I feel like, okay, this is the real deal. You know, this is like huge, and this is not something that you can easily replicate anywhere. Like anyone can pluck, you know, little things that we've covered along the way, but no one can take command of the whole thing unless they really spend a lifetime studying this. And I feel like my own conviction and confidence rising in the fact that, okay, we have actually, you know, we often talk about, yeah, Islam is, you know, a moral message for all of humanity. And, you know, but now we've actually covered the ground to really back that up with something solid. And it's not even about trying necessarily to convince someone anymore that they should pay attention. It's more like, okay, now we've done it. I feel like it's here. If you want it, it's your choice. I don't need to convince you. Now it's truly just your choice if you want to take the time and invest in it. Because for me, the answers are everything that we've covered. And, you know, it ties into a lot of what the Sheikh said in yesterday's khutbah, which was so powerful to me. And I feel like I've been waiting for him to just kind of say this for a really long time, which is that, you know, we really have an elevated moral message that is backed up by everything that we've been covering in the Qur'an. It's something that we in humanity need in this dark world. We live in a very, very dark world. And what are we all looking for? We're looking for the way forward. And I feel like we are so blessed that everything that we've covered here, and now with a critical mass, way beyond a critical mass, here's the answer, and here is where we as Muslims need to rise and say, okay, we have something better to offer. We're not just another team. You know, we're not just another group of people that have a different ideology, a different understanding. This is actually something that can elevate all of us. And that's what, so, you know, I want to really call everyone's attention to watching yesterday's khutbah, because it honestly is like the summation of everything that we're doing. It's like, what is the point of being Muslim if you are not about an elevated moral message and being a moral example to the world, even if no one else understands what you're doing? God sees what you're doing. And I feel like, you know, we've now covered enough ground that we can say that with confidence. We can back it up. It's not just pie in the sky optics, you know, nice rhetoric, nice jargon, nice trying to make us feel like our club is good too. No, we actually have something much more elevated and much more important. And with that comes a cause and a mission that can be the source of all kinds of enlightenment and empowerment, even if you're just one person in a completely surrounded in a dark world. So I wanted to just point out, I mean, it's all connected, right? I mean, it's like what we're doing in understanding the Quran, what Sheikh talks about yesterday. You know, part of the problem is that we as Muslims are like the modern day Israelites, because we have now made all the mistakes that God warned the Israelites about, and that understanding our Quran and all the messages to the Israelites need to be taken as messages to us, and it's clear that we've failed in the same ways. So it's you know, it's an amazing time that we live in. And with that, I also wanted to share like an article that I thought was also very telling. There's a really amazing article that came out in the Atlantic, and it's called "Why American Teens Are So Sad." And what is really fascinating is, so just this first paragraph: the United States is experiencing an extreme teenage mental health crisis. From 2009 to 2021, the share of American high school students who say they feel persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness rose from 26% to 44%, according to a new CDC study. And this is the highest level of teenage sadness ever recorded. And it goes on and talks about, you know, why this is. And I thought I would share some of this with you because it was really enlightening, and also just being the mother of a teenager. You know, Mito just turned 17 last week. You know, I see this, and I see it very clearly. We've lived it, and it's a really powerful article. Because teenagers now are experiencing something that, you know, we never experienced as teenagers. I mean, life changes and the circumstances change. So while, for example, it's a really interesting irony is that self-reported teen behaviors like driving and drinking, fighting, bullying, sex before 13, those numbers have all declined. So from a behavioral perspective, things are more positive. But objective measures of things like eating disorders and self-harming behaviors and teen suicides are all tremendously up. And these were all things that were trending even before COVID. So this article posits that there are four main reasons why this is. One is social media use. Of course, it's no surprise, likening it to something like alcohol, mildly addictive, and that can enhance social situations, but can lead to dependency and depression among a minority of users. And you know, there was someone who, or several quotes about how Instagram made, you know, people feel worse, but they felt unable to stop themselves from using it. The second factor is what he calls sociality, which is down, which is like, you know, socializing with your friends, because social media certainly has replaced a lot of better activities that would allow, you know, teenagers to interact. It's also cut into their sleep. So there are 30% more people who are getting less than 8 hours of sleep because of it. And so this generation is less likely to go out with their friends or get their driver's license or play sports. And they're feeling a lot more loneliness and aloneness as a part of this. And, you know, so certainly they were feeling more isolation with, with the onset of social media, I think there was a statistic that starting 2012, we passed the 50% mark of people actually having a phone and social media, and that correlates very clearly to a change in these numbers. But so kids have been feeling more isolation before COVID, and then certainly when COVID hit, it just made everything worse. Point number 3 is that the world is just simply more stressful, and there's just so much bad news. And I think for teenagers it is overwhelming between things like gun violence and climate change, war and politics and finances. It's just, and with the media just focused obviously on bad news, it's hard not to be depressed about what you're seeing in the world. And then lastly, the effect of modern parenting, which is really interesting because as the world has become more dark and challenging and depressing, parents oftentimes have tried harder to protect their children, and ironically creating more stress and anxiety. So they push them harder to make sure they get into good colleges. And this is a trend mostly with upper middle class college educated people. They're really concerned about their kids getting good grades and, having good applications and very active and going, sports and all that kind of stuff. So kids feel a lot of pressure to perform in preparation for college. And then simultaneous to that, which is very interesting, is as a matter of love, parents have become a lot more accommodating. So this idea of accommodative parenting. So if, for example, a child is scared of dogs, that you would shield them from dogs as opposed to saying, no, you should actually try and get comfortable. Or if a child doesn't like vegetables, then you might eat turkey loaf for 4 years, which is an actual thing that there's an actual article about this. But I've seen so many examples of this where parents just accommodate whatever the kids feel uncomfortable with, and that ultimately teaches them an inability to tolerate discomfort. And also, they have so many things taken care of for them that they also have a lack of sense of personal competence, which are, two obviously important skills that allow them to cope with stress in the world. And then also as the world becomes more stressful for us as parents, then, we as adults, kids obviously pick up on that. And so when you put all of these things together, it is a really, really difficult time. Interestingly, as from our perspective, obviously talking about these things, no mention obviously of religion, of God, of purpose, of, cause, higher anything. And so this is for us and for our purposes, I think really important to notice, and especially, in light of, the khutbah that I mentioned yesterday and all of the work that we do here. It's like so meaningful when you believe that there is a purpose, that there is a cause, that there is a light, and there is a way forward. And it's so important, especially for our teenagers, to learn that. And we as Muslims, understanding this message that we are learning, to pass that on, not even just to ourselves, but to our children. And so it just, again, underscores for me the importance of the work that we're doing, and turning back to our foundations, understanding our Qur'an. The Sheikh talks about how, when people lose touch with the Qur'an, it's like you've literally lost your lifeline. So anyway, all of this to say, I'm so grateful for this journey. I can't believe that we have covered so many surahs and we still have so many more to go. But I already feel an incredible difference in just what we've done. It's like even a small portion of what we've done is life transforming, but when you start adding them up, and now we're starting our 75th surah, that's crazy. That's amazing. And I feel so blessed, and I just want to thank the Sheikh and thank everyone who's been with us on this journey. You know what's been involved in this, and there's so much to gain. If you're just finding us, stay with it, because it just gets better and better with every single surah. And I can't wait for tonight's surah Mujadilah. We were all like kind of making guesses about what the next one would be. Joe gets the award because he called it a long time ago. And also this is a really sweet surah because there is a Quran study group where several of the members sponsored this through our Adopt a Surah program. So I let them know, and so we've got then probably a team of Quran book people going, yes, this is our surah. So anyway, thank you for joining us, and looking forward to an amazing session.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي يا رب العالمين. Um, so Surah Al-Mujadilah, or as has been reported, also Al-Mujadilah, of course the the difference is whether it is referring to Al-Mujadilah, the argument or the pleading, or as we will see, the communicative interaction that took place between the Prophet ﷺ and a woman who brought a complaint to the Prophet ﷺ, or whether if it's in Mujadilah, then it refers to the person who is responsible for the discussion or the argument or the pleading or the communicative act. Anyway, we'll see. I think that it is not. I think it is quite purposeful that this surah became known as Surah Al-Mujadilah because the primary focus of the surah, once you take the entire message in, and considers a number of things that we'll point out to, is that indeed the surah itself deals with, in our terms, in our age, what we would call moral responsibility in discourse. Because we notice that the surah starts with the idea of al-mujadalah, where the communicative act starts out between a woman, well, actually, before even the woman comes to the Prophet, the communicative act actually starts out between the woman and her husband, or a husband and his wife, or a wife and her husband. Then it goes from the wife, from this to the wife and the Prophet. And then it goes from the wife and the Prophet to the wife and God. And then it goes from wife to God to a revelation where God then speaks to not just the woman, but to existence at large, humanity at large, Muslims at large. But then, what is the main and primary theme of the surah? Well, so the Mujadilah, which refers to a communicative act that as we said, that starts out between a couple and then moves on to the Prophet, moves on to God, moves on from God to humanity. Well, other than in Mujadilah, the other main signifier in the surah is a najwa, And as we will see, a najwa is again a form of communication. But like the very idea of al-mujadalah, while al-jidal, or especially al-mujadalah, refers to an actual demonstrative incident that unfolded, that led to a revelation. And as we'll talk about, what is the heart and core of this revelation? Well, al-najwa is a dynamic of discourse. And I'll elaborate on this, but that here you have a type of discourse. I'll just stick to this term, which in fact juxtaposed to what happened with the woman and her husband. It's a discourse that often has an exclusionary nature, meaning that it intentionally leaves God out and intentionally tries to obscure itself from the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And then what is fascinating about the surah is that the notion of Hizbullah, the notion of a party of God, which is a very powerful symbolic construct. The idea that there is a party of God and a party of shaitan, a party of you either belong to a divine party or you belong to a demonic party, is a very powerful symbolic construct. And this idea of Hizbullah as the party of God is invoked only in this surah and in Surah Al-Ma'idah. But even in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is a later revelation than Surah Al-Mujadilah, is the way that it is mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah builds upon what was already, the foundation already laid in Surah Al-Mujadilah. So the communicative act or the dynamics of communications, who are the participants in a speech, the nature, the intentionality behind a speech, indeed speech itself and the way that we handle speech can either end up in the category of Hizbullah or Hizbul Shaitan. Now, as we will see, this surah is embedded in a historical reality. But the meaning far transcends the historical reality. You know, as there is a qaida that they say, we rely on umum al-lafz not خصوصية السبب, that the reason for revelation could be specific, but the language could be general. And what matters, so we consider the circumstances of revelation in order to understand the dynamics, the trajectory of the ayat, the trajectory of meaning. But the circumstances of revelation doesn't mean that it traps the meaning of the revelation. And we'll see, I'll give you a very concrete example of this as to how sometimes interpreters, although they all are aware of the principle that I cited, that we rely on umum al-lafz, we rely on the broadness of the linguistic expression, not on the specificity of the historical circumstance, but they end up trapping the text of the Qur'an in the circumstances of revelation, sometimes even unintentionally, as we'll see. And well, anyway, let's wait until we get there so I don't confuse everyone. Okay, so it is really fascinating that we do Mujadilah right after Surah An-Nisa, because in Surah An-Nisa, in Surah An-Nisa, we saw the whole process of legal or of divine revelation that creates trajectories of ethical movement and ethical transformations, and expressed as legal reforms. And Surah An-Nisa consistently, and Surah An-Nisa it reminds us that all the trajectory of these legal reforms is to deal with the problem of istidaf, the disempowerment. And in Surah An-Nisa, it educates us on how there is many different forms of resistance to change. And, you know, at the risk of generalization and simplification, that the ailment in resisting these ethical reforms and these legal reforms is hypocrisy. Surah Al-Mujadilah, in many ways, is still connected to this dynamic, except here the focus is not on istidaf, but the focus is on how the morality of speech itself, how we relate to the normative role of the word discourse is often comes with a lot of baggage because of the way it has been used by a lot of theoreticians and so on. So a lot of times I hesitate a bit before I say discourse. But I mean, if you can take the word discourse without a lot of the philosophical baggage, discourse as the dynamics of communication and the way that we uphold morality through communications, or the way we defeat moral goals through communications. We human beings, we're supposed to be social animals, right? Even when we do things like, isolate ourselves in a room and communicate only through electronics, is still a form of socialization. Maybe an unhealthy form of socialization, but nevertheless. So, and the heart of this dynamic of socialization is communication. But it is precisely the dynamic of communicating, i.e., discoursing, where we either create moral systems or we undermine moral systems. The very role of speech is at the heart and core of what we do as human beings. And the amazing thing about Surah Al-Mujadilah, and what is even more amazing, that it is called, that even at this very early age in Islam, again, considering the historical time, that people had the awareness to reject all alternative but possible names for the surah, and to say, no, this is about precisely that. Jidal. There were some early traditions of calling it Surah Al-Najwa, but Mujadilah even captures the very idea of Jidal, captures Najwa can possibly not include a process of Jidal, but Jidal would include not only Jidal but also include Najwa. So in other words, the term Mujadilah itself is comprehensive enough to incorporate what would normally be called a Mujadilah and what would also be called a Najwa. Okay. Yeah. Then the other thing that is noteworthy about Surah Al-Mujadilah is that there's something striking about the surah, is that in every ayah in Surah Al-Mujadilah, every single ayah, Ismul Jalala occurs at least one time, either from 1 to 3 times. If you go through every ayah in Surah Al-Mujadilah, you'll find that Ismul Jalala, Allah's name, is mentioned in every ayah from 1 to 3 times. By my count, 35 times in the surah. This is in the surah that, as we said, even before Surah Al-Ma'idah, and in a more systematic way than Surah Al-Ma'idah, mentions Hizbullah as opposed to Hizbul Shaitan. So we have in part a dynamic that continues the conversation about legal reform and legal change, but that focuses on the role of speech and how a society is to use speech, and how speech can be used to uphold morality, or speech can be used to thoroughly undermine the moral project of this ummah, ultimately leading one of either recreating Hizbullah or Hizbul Shaitan, the party of God or the party of Shaitan. Because in speech itself, and as we will see when speech itself, I mean, in our modern language, we say speech itself is a creative act, but beyond that, speech itself creates realities, and creates realities that sometimes are very distorted. So, how do I explain this? All too often, this happens all the time. There's a reality that you or I might want to exist in our psyche, or a reality that you or I perceive in our quietness. So without speech, if there was a machine that translated my perceptions into a narrative, and you plug this machine could then describe how Khalid Abul Fadl understands the reality of the house he lives in, for instance, right? Or Khalid Abul Fadl understands the reality of his relationship with his family. Or the way Khalid Abul Fadl understands the reality of his relationship with his wife. Or the reality of his relationship with his job. If there was such a machine, but there is no such a machine. There is, however, a God who reads, who knows the reality that exists in this consciousness. But is this the same reality that is actually webbed and woven when we start speaking about our reality? And the answer is, it might, but it might not be. It depends. So, let's say God understands, or we said there's no machine that's going to read my consciousness and my reality as perceived by my consciousness, but there is a God. And let's say my wife annoys me, and the speech that comes out of my mouth describes something completely different than before my wife annoyed me, what I thought the reality of my relationship with my wife is. But once the speech that left my mouth came out, it constructed a different reality. Now, look how the construction of reality through speech can easily get away from me, get away from all of us. And the moral question that Surah Al-Mujadilah poses before you, okay, now, did you deal with this constructed reality in a morally responsible way? Because once that reality is constructed through speech, there are a new set of facts that now pose serious challenges to your consciousness. Either you have to reel back this reality to your true consciousness, or your consciousness will actually shift with this reality to accommodate the construct that you've created, albeit despite yourself. And this is precisely what we human beings do all the time. We think, we like to believe, we like to pretend that we always have it under control. That, oh yeah, I say what I mean and I mean what I say, but that's nonsense. This is why you could start out in a job that you like, and slowly the reality of the job has changed because you've said things and people said things to you that have altered the reality that used to be. And it could very well be not because you intended it, but because you reacted to a series of events, all in ways that has constructed a new reality that now has become inescapable. But Allah puts us before a very serious challenge, because Allah is saying in every time have you constructed something nearer to the realm of the divine, Hizbullah, or the realm of the demonic, Hizbul Shaitan. Okay. So the surah starts with something, again, all too often overlooked. The typical tafsir tell you, there's, Khawla bint Tha'laba, a woman who, goes to the Prophet. They focus on sort of like but let's take a step back. Okay, so Mujadilah is revealed after Surah An-Nisa, and see, how close to Surah An-Nisa. What we can say is close. I mean, we know that it is revealed around the year 4 Hijrah. Either end of the year, the end of the 4th year, or the beginning of the 5th year. But most likely, in my opinion, it is the 4th year. And I don't think it was the beginning of the 5th year. I think it was either the middle of the 4th year or the end of the 4th year. And it is revealed close to Surah An-Nisa. Okay. And what the tafsir always tell you is the occasion for revelation, and the occasion that is mentioned in, of course, Surah Al-Mujadilah itself is a reference that Allah heard the complaint, or Allah heard the woman who comes complaining to the Prophet, right? Because Allah hears what you talk about. So, Khawla bint Tha'laba is married to a man called Al-Aws ibn Samit. Both are Ansaris. And Al-Aws ibn Samit is an interesting figure. I mean, there are reports about him that either he, in his old age, he sort of became sort of grouchy. Maybe he was a little bit crass, rough around the edges, not very refined. But Khawla loved him, and we know that Khawla, who outlives her husband, even after her husband dies during the caliphate of Omar. So it still speaks well of her husband, although again he was sort of gruff and not the most refined human being. So okay, so then of course, as usual, there's a certain amount of disagreement among the narratives that, but if you take what they cumulatively convey, disagreements are is that Khawla's husband approaches her. In some reports, that he just tells you that there was an argument. It doesn't tell you why the argument was there. But other reports tell you that the reason for the argument is that he made sexual advances towards her, but in a gruff way. And that he was a sort of a gruff human being, and so she repels him. She says no, and he is hurt by the fact that she says no to him, and he then pronounces the zihar. Now, the zihar was an pre-Islamic Arab practice where a husband tells his wife, "Anti alayya ka dhahr ummi," that you are like the back of my mother to me. And it's a figure of speech. And the figure of speech is like saying, "You are like my mother to me," which again is a figure of speech that is intended to communicate to a wife that, I can't deal with you like a wife anymore. You're like a haram, like a sister or like a mother, like someone that I can't have conjugal relations with. Women, we know from all types of sources that it was considered by women an offensive a rebuke. It was a form of rebuke, but it was offensively received. Moreover, that now, depending on what region you're from in pre-Islamic Arabia, either once you said the statement, that meant the marriage is dissolved, so it was considered a form of talaq, or in which I suspect from all types of different reasons that it was actually the practice in Mecca as opposed to Medina, was that if you said zihar, then you no longer deal with your wife as a wife, but at the same time she is not free to marry someone else. So she's neither married nor divorced. She's a mu'allaqa. I don't believe the mu'allaqa format is what existed in Medina. I think in Medina, it sounds to me like in the practice in Medina that the pronunciation of zihar was more like a divorce. It dissolves a marriage. But the thing about zihar is like, in some societies in the Arab world that, swear was talaq. It was uttered, but you didn't mean it. So that husbands would say it in anger, and because they say it in anger, there would be they would refrain from having conjugal relations for a period of time, and then once they cool down, they just return to each other without a new contract or a new marriage or anything. So that it was sort of done in a way in which, again, within the paradigm that I'm going to show you, inshallah, in which speech would create new realities. But the thing about zihar is that when you start tracking it and tracking what were the results of zihar in Arab culture, you find the thing that strikes you is how the extent to which this speech would create realities that would get out of control. So you even have pronouncements of zihar, which lead to feuds between tribes that would go on for years and years, because it is not clear whether this woman is actually married to this man or not, just because of the pronouncement of zihar. And what happened in this situation with Khawla actually demonstrates this, because when what's his name? Aus ibn Samit. When Aus ibn Samit pronounces the zihar, and she, of course, is offended, Khawla is offended, and then after some time passes, a couple of days pass, Aus goes back to Khawla and says, basically wants to have conjugal relations. And she says, no, you said zihar. And he says, well, I didn't mean it. And she says, well, no, you will not touch me unless I bring the matter to the Prophet. Now, you think from this that Khawla wants a divorce, because she say, you're not going to touch me unless I ask the Prophet. You'd think that she wants a divorce, but as it turns out, in fact, she doesn't want a divorce, but it is clear that she also doesn't think that it's a casual matter, that you can say something like this and it have no moral consequences. That in fact she wants to know whether in fact this speech has produced an actual act of dissolution or no. We know that men would say zihar all the time and then say, we've changed our mind. We know that or I didn't really mean it. But what compelled Khawla to take a stand and not be like all the other, as we will see in the reports that I will tell you about in a second, all like the many other situations where men would say zihar, and then women would have conjugal relations with them without further ado, once they cooled down. But Khawla made a stand. And she takes the matter to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet, there's two versions of the reports. One version that the Prophet ﷺ says, I don't know what the answer is. And another version is the Prophet says, حرمتي عليه, that you are, in fact, that now your marriage is dissolved. Both versions agree that Khawla doesn't want the marriage to be dissolved. But it makes you wonder then, okay, so what did she want when she brought it to the Prophet? And it is clear that what she wanted was to sort of hold her husband, or to stress upon her husband the seriousness of this matter. But once she hears from the Prophet that in fact the marriage is over, and she keeps asking him, well, what's the solution? And she, in some versions of the report, she even says that I have children, and if I let him have custody of the children, they will get lost. Perhaps she thought that he was not a very patient father, or he was not a good father. But she says that if he takes custody, they're going to get lost. And if I take custody, they're going to starve. So, but again, what is when you gather everything that you can find about Khawla and her husband, it turns out that Khawla actually loved her husband. It wasn't just like, and in fact there is in some traditions where Khawla says, Khawla's asked, years later, and some reports say that this was at the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, but anyway, I don't know if it was actually that late. But anyway, they asked, well, you are, because Khawla became sort of had a special status after this. She's the woman that occasioned a revelation of the Qur'an, and that became like a status. And so people would ask her, well, what compelled you to, how did God, you were the woman who God listened to, God heard from seven heavens and responded to. How did you, what, she'd say, I wanted to make a point that and I forgot how it was phrased, but anyway, that basically that it is no light matter that men pronounce as zihar. Okay, so then she keeps arguing with or pleading or appealing her case, and the Prophet ﷺ basically says, I don't have a solution. Either I don't know, or more likely that I think your marriage has been dissolved. And then the revelation in response to this, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allah has heard the woman, the discussant, or the pleading, or the disputant. It's been translated in all these different ways. Muhammad Asad just says, God has indeed heard the words of her who pleads, also pleads. Yeah, so he prefers pleading. But you find, and because Tujadilah doesn't necessarily mean argue with you, it could be someone pleading with you, it could be someone the thing is that they are going back and forth with you. They are not receiving one thing and just walking away. But critically, that the woman goes from speech with her husband, to speech with the Prophet, to speech to God, because once she hears what the Prophet has to say, she raises her hands to the heavens and starts complaining to God that she is in a difficult situation, that she's unhappy, so on and so forth. And the revelation, when the revelation comes, look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, right? الذين يظاهرون منكم من نسائهم ما هن أمهاتهم, underscoring something that is rather obvious. It's like speech has constructed a reality by saying you are like my mother. The constructed reality of that speech is she in fact became haram for you. Your speech, although she is not your mother, but it constructed a hurma, it constructed a regal relationship because of that speech. And Allah comes and rolls back on that in a very fact of matter, reminding us that your speech is in fact corrupting reality. And saying it in the most, and remarkably, so many commentators, are not struck by the fact that the response to this, and some are like struck by it, but they don't have an answer as to why. But that Allah just says in a very matter of fact, well, they're not their mothers. Their mothers is the one who gave birth to them. Well, all of us know that, right? But Allah doesn't speak in a vain fashion or just to entertain us. The point is Allah saying your speech is constructing a corruption. And in this case, Allah intervenes to roll back this corruption. But there is a price to you using speech in a way that corrupts. And the price are the kaffarat. And the kaffarat is either you free a slave, you feed 60 indigents. If you can't free a slave and you can't feed 60, then you fast 2 months. Now, remember that if you kill someone by mistake, the kafara is to free a raqabah. So here, the corrupting influence of speech it's a form of fitna. It's a very serious offense, serious enough to warrant that it's as if to undo the corruption you need to create liberty. You need to give life. In the same way that slavery is taking life, well, by freeing a raqabah, you are giving life. Now, of course, Khawla, her personality is fascinating, and I'll tell you why I'm focusing on her personality in a second. But so Khawla tells the Prophet ﷺ, well, we don't have slaves, and we can't afford to buy a slave to free. Okay, well, feed 60. Well, we don't. If anything, we need to be fed. We don't have the resources to feed anyone. Okay, well, tell your husband to fast 2 months. My husband is too weak. He can't fast 2 months. And then the Prophet ﷺ donates to her the money that, and actually in some reports, the Prophet donates most of the money so her husband can feed 60 indigents, and she herself donates the rest. And she tells the Prophet, well, if it's okay, my husband, can I just help him out? And so I mean, she obviously wants this marriage, and she wants this marriage even to the point that she's willing to and just so you get a sense of Khawla's personality, she doesn't disappear in Islamic history after this, but she's very proud of the fact that she's the woman that that was at the locus of Surah Al-Mujadilah, right? And so she also not dialed in, not an influential figure. She's not a very eloquent spokesperson. She doesn't have a lot of resources, but during the Khilafah, during Umar's Khilafah, she actually stops him and she gets in the habit of stopping him as he's going back and forth and lecturing him about the public good. Unfortunately, the sources didn't preserve for us what precisely the content of her speech was, other than to tell us that she would tell Omar, she would make her opinions known, but that it would always be, she would make it in a way that she's very much aware. She's very much proud of herself and aware of her status, because it's not, she doesn't go to the mosque and raise her hand to say a word. No, she waits until he is traveling, stops him, and speaks to him very publicly in front of everyone. And when Omar is asked why he puts up with this old woman by younger, useful people, and he says, do you guys know who this woman is? This is the woman who Allah listened to from 7 heavens. If Allah listened to her from 7 heavens, wouldn't Omar listen to her? I mean, if Allah's self listened to this woman, a priori, Omar must listen to this woman. This type of now, why am I mentioning this? Because my normal pedagogy is that I hold the delivery point till the end. But in this situation, I'm going to deliver it at the beginning rather than the end, because I fear in this case, holding on to it till the end, you will miss, or you will not pay attention to that. You might miss the relevance of several points if you don't know where I'm going with it. No, although I don't do that often, but so here we have, can we call it a situation of istidaf? Well, sometimes Zihar did produce istidaf, as in disempowerment, especially when it resulted in a woman being a mu'allaqa. But here in Surah Al-Mujadilah, it is not in every case or in every situation. In many cases, a woman would just be divorced and not necessarily a mu'allaqa. But so it is not necessarily the element of disempowerment as the element of the wrongs that the way that the wrongs that can result from abuse or abusing communications. And again, we'll see how this is woven into the rest of Surah. Abusing speech and the dynamic is that you can never historically freeze what the types of wrongs that speech can generate. In other words, this is a highly contingent and highly fluid situation. What type of constructs, and what the minute we say constructs from speech, we are also immediately saying, well, there could be corruptions, because there could be constructs that are Hizbul Shaitan and there could be constructs that are Hizbullah, right? So now what if about the constructs that produces figuratively Hizbul Shaitan? In this situation, a woman takes the corruption that arises from her interaction with her husband, she takes that to the Prophet. The Prophet doesn't give her a solution. She complains to God. God gives her a solution. Okay, now what do we do when the Prophet is dead? And you have a complaint, but you can still articulate your complaint to God, but we don't have a revelation. We don't have God speaking to us through revelation to solve the misconstructs, the way that our social dynamics, social discourses, social intercourses produces corruptions. Surah Al-Mujadilah will tell us a lot about what we need to in fact. But here's the moral impetus. It is that it is absolutely incumbent upon us to have the moral consciousness and the moral understanding that Hizbullah or Hizbul Shaitan is not about a didactic reading of texts and saying, well, here's what the text says, and fit your problems within the formulas provided by the text. Because that in itself is a corruption. The disparity between the solutions provided by the text and the evolving reality will get worse and worse and worse. In the absence of the Prophet ﷺ, we must have a voice, a dynamic, a process for delivering solutions to social ills that is as vibrant and as lively as the way Allah solved this woman's problem. And I'll show you, remember I told you that there are things that, unless I told you what the, and I'll show you in Surah Al-Mujadilah all these things that Surah Al-Mujadilah is underscoring. If your dynamics of najwa, which, well, and we'll get to, I have a lot to say about najwa, but let's say if the dynamics of your discursive processes, to use our contemporary language, if you have discursive prophecies, you construct realities through these discursive processes. These realities inevitably will get away from you. They will construct realities that are often in competition with your intentionality. You will intend one thing and construct another thing. Now, to what extent is God part of this process? Because as we will see with Najwa, when God is not a part of this process, that's a problem. But what is even as bad is that when you say God is part of this process, but God is misrepresented because you don't have someone that hears the Mujadilah. You don't have, so God hears, but revelation has ended. So what is the process that is representing the presence of the divine in your midst? It's one thing to say, yeah, God exists, God hears. Yeah, I'm complaining to God, Allah hears my complaint. Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil, right? I mean, Allah is, but okay, but if the presence of God is not translated into solving problems the same way that Allah solved this woman's problems, you've created Hizb al-Shaitan. Excluding the divine is Hizb al-Shaitan, but so is also misembodying the divine. And that is precisely why that is precisely why I believe, and we'll see when we talk about darajat and ilm, that the absolute, if there is a field which it should be the most competitive in terms of standards for education and admission, it should be al-ulum al-ilahiyya, the law that represents the divine will. It should be the most competitive. If it's a field that should be the most demanding in terms of its curriculum and pedagogy and system of education, not 2 years in Medina, it absolutely should be, because what is required is a dynamic, an intellect that fully understands everything from the dynamics of, or at least is open, as we will see in a second, because Surah, even that Allah tells us about, is open to understanding. discursive dynamics, epistemological dynamics, deontological dynamics, the process of that looks at the psychology of human beings, the sociology of human beings, the sociology of law, the psychology of law, that, and all of that, not to rule over people, but to even articulate a suggested divine will. Because the point is no one will become God. We don't have people that will rule like the Pope, like, I speak for God. No. But even to just say you have voices in society that can act as a resource for the potential voice of God is a very serious responsibility. And we'll see what Surah Mujadilah says about this in a second. Okay. Okay. And by the way, Tahrir al-Raqaba, which is one of the kafarat for dhihar, just before I move on, that Tahrir al-Raqaba is any form of releasing human beings from oppressive bondage. Although historically, and again, the umum al-lafz is what matters. The Tahrir al-Raqaba, although historically it's referring to the institution and slavery, but I think that any form of freeing a human being from bondage. So if you come and you free someone who's being trafficked in modern day human trafficking, that's a Tahrir Raqaba. If you come to someone who is in jail because of debt and you pay off their debts and you free them from jail, in civil law countries, people can be jailed for debts. For the most part, not in common law countries. But your life could be destroyed anyway, because of debt. There are some people, debt can, although they're not in jail, but debt can absolutely just, tear their lives apart. And if you come and you pay off their debts and free them, that's Tahrir al-Raqaba. The other thing is, it is too easy, because the way I, like so many others, studied this is that, okay, Zihar, you used to be a historical experience. You say you are like the, back of my mother. Well, we don't do it anymore. So, hukm al-aya nusakh. If there's someone who says it, then okay, then this kafara applies to them. But this way of dealing with the Qur'an, I think is really objectionable. The hukm remains effective because, yes, we might not use that expression, but get to the heart of the matter. What other expressions that we could use that could cause emotional injury, that would express the intimation of divorce, although we don't intend divorce. And when Allah says, often Islamophobes and Orientalists say, "Oh, in Islam, Islam doesn't take divorce seriously." Again, it's that's the way the impact of colonial discourses on Islam, and of course, misapplication of the law as well. Because for Islam to for Allah to look at something and act like this as requiring such a serious kafara. It's, in a word, Allah is saying, you know, take careful responsibility for what you say, because some of what you say can have the type of corrupting impact that in the eyes of Allah is so serious that to expiate for this sin would require such a heavy kafara. I mean, fasting 2 months, because actually, you know, when you talk to modern Muslims, you're struck by some other Muslims who like don't even get the seriousness of something until you tell them fast 2 months. It's like, oh, fast 2 months. Oh, now that's serious. But you know, you told them free someone from slavery, feed 60 people. They just don't get it. You know, what does that mean? The responsibility of what we say, and what we say creates reality, and the reality we create, we are morally responsible for. But there is then, it's a responsibility upon society at large, and that is the legal dynamics and legal responsiveness of society must keep up with the moral dynamics and ethical dynamics of society. If the law is basically in its own constructed reality, and it has very little to do and very little recourse, in what ends up happening is precisely what we are living through, and that is we all pay lip service to Sharia, but when it comes down to it, if our children tell us we're going to specialize in Sharia, we're deeply distressed. If they're going to go specialize in medicine, we're happy. We want our daughters to marry doctors, not to marry Sharia people. These are all, but again, because it's our collective societies as Muslims have not made of Sharia a very serious field. If Sharia basically is to read books that are found in books of positive law that were written in the 4th century Hijrah, and to tell people, well, that's God's law, well, that's not very impressive. You don't need a very developed intellect to do that. And so, in turn, people don't have a very high regard, because it seems like you read a real intellect to read abstractions in a highly evolving field like medicine or various sciences and so on. Okay, anyway. Oh, it's Maghrib already? Mm-hmm. Okay, we got break 10 minutes for Maghrib. 10 minutes for Maghrib. Don't go away. I guess, yeah, anyway. 10 minutes for Maghrib and break iftar, and we'll be back. Don't go away. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Are you guys still fasting? Raise your hand if you're still fasting. Oh. Haram. It's... Well, you're receiving ajr because I'm drinking in front of you. So the hasanat is counting. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. One of the fascinating thing that you find now in this context is, so there are the riwayat that tell you about the institution of zihar before the revelation of this verse. But there are also riwayat that tell you about the institution of zihar after the revelation of this verse. And what, so for instance, there's a riwayah from about an Ansari called Salma bin Sukhra al-Bayadi, who, I mean, it's sort of a little colorful, but apparently Salma bin Sukhra had a strong sexual drive. That's what the riwayah says. And so, and he, yeah, he has a, yeah. I'm trying to stay, you know, PG. So he, Ramadan comes along, and he is worried. He wants to abstain from conjugal relations during Ramadan. And he wants to abstain from conjugal relations because he is worried that if he has conjugal relations at night, that sex will be on his mind when he's fasting. And he doesn't want sex to be on his mind when he's fasting. So he goes and he does zihar, or he pronounces zihar towards his wife for the duration of Ramadan. So he tells her that in the course of Ramadan, you are like the back of my mother to me. But then, according to the riwayah, there is one night he sees her silhouette in the light of the moon. And he can't hold himself back, and what happens. And so then he goes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, you know, okay. And the Prophet, of course, tells him, you know, don't you know that you shouldn't say zihar anymore? It says, well, you know, I didn't want to have sex on my mind during Ramadan. And so now what happened, you know, what? So the Prophet tells him, okay, well, you can't come near your wife again unless you do the kafara. There is other riwayat, some of them quite long, so I mean, I'm not going to go. Some of them about, like the same, about Salma bin Sakhr, but in a longer version. And the longer version riwayah is reported about someone else. And the longer version has some telling aspects that I think are worth. So you have the basic structure that there is the pronouncement of zihar, but in these other versions, the pronouncement of zihar is not done to abstain from during Ramadan, but the pronouncement of zihar is the result of lack of control. Like basically he pronounces it for but then again the same element that after the pronouncement of zihar, as is consistent with what we know about what would frequently happen, is that it's pronounced but the husband doesn't really mean it, and there is resumption of conjugal relations after the pronouncement of zihar, but then the realization after presumption of conjugal relations that, oh, well, we've got a problem because now the Qur'an requires a kafara for marital relations to continue. But the variant that I want to just point out is that, and let's stick with Salma bin Sakhr, because just for convenience sake, that so Salma bin Sakhr in these variants, he same elements, and in fact in one of the reports he says قد أتيت من جماع النساء ما لم يؤت غيري. I was very virulent, and so little bit of, but once the conjugal relations take place, so he says he realizes there's a serious problem now, because he's pronounced zihar and he's broken the zihar by resuming conjugal relations. So he starts going to different people, some of them family members, and saying, what do you think I should do? So they say, well, you've got to speak to the Prophet ﷺ. And he says to them, well, I am worried about, I'm embarrassed to go tell the Prophet by myself, come with me. And they respond, لا والله لا نفعل نتخوف أن ينزل فينا قرآن. That no, we won't come with you because we are worried that a revelation will come about us. أو يقول فينا رسول الله مقالة يبقى علينا عارها. Or that the Prophet ﷺ would say something in response to us that would shame us for time to come. And basically they tell him, you're on your own. اذهب أنت فاصنع ما بدلك. Okay, we're not going to come with you. So in this narrative, he eventually goes and tells the Prophet ﷺ what happened. And the Prophet says to him, oh, then first he chides them for engaging in the har in the first place, but then says, okay, you've got to free a raqaba, a slave. And so he strikes his own neck, and he says, by God, I don't own other than this. So he says, well, feed 60 indigent people, sittina miskina. So he tells them, by God, if I'm able to feed myself once a day, I would be fortunate. So the Prophet ﷺ then says, so fast 2 months. And he says, and again in these versions, he says to him, the whole problem was created because of fasting. Like basically, I'm not going to be able to. So the Prophet says, okay, go to Beit al-Mal, take money from Beit al-Mal, and feed 60 people. So the Beit al-Mal gives them the money to pay the expatriation. So he then goes to the people that he asked to come with him, and he says, he returns to say, وجدت عندكم الضيق وسوء الرأي ووجدت عند رسول الله السعة والبركة. That with you, you gave me no solutions, and what I found with you is only hardship and problems. And when I went to the Prophet, what I found with him is ease and blessings. So, in other words, you guys made my life very hard, and he solved it for me. Now, these narratives, if you ponder them, so we know that this is an ingrained social practice, and a social practice that will take time to be rooted out. But also that the way that the Prophet ﷺ manages the rooting out of the social practice in itself is quite responsive, and indeed combines all the elements that you would want from a responsive legal system: ease, understanding, flexibility, dynamism, the solution of, even to say, regardless of whether these are historical reports or pedagogical constructs, it's all the same for me, because what they are communicating is solving the problem in a way that maintains principles but generates actual solutions. And to say, well, I'm not able to fast 2 months, and for the Prophet ﷺ to solve the problem by saying, well, okay, then it becomes the collectivity will pay for the kafara, upholds the principle, but does not exhaust or does not abuse the individuals involved in the dynamic. Okay, I want to make sure I don't forget it. So this goes back to the same element that we before Maghrib. I was focusing on that while Allah reminds us, وَتِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ وَلِلْكَافِرِينَ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ, that these are Allah's hudud, that prohibition of dhihar and the kafarat of dhihar, but the dynamism of the response itself, preserved in the riwayat, is quite telling, especially in light of what will come after. Okay, so then Allah reminds us that from this dynamic in which we have a woman that is eager for a solution from Allah, that brings the problem to Allah and the Prophet, and brings them, ultimately appeals to Allah, and Allah provides a solution. And taken with the riwayat that shows the Prophet ﷺ completely with the program, so to speak, and makes Allah's law, upholds the hududullah in principle, but at the same time, hududullah is not out to torment or flagellate or abuse people. From there, we are taken to what one can say is juxtaposed to something that, if you're reading the text carefully, should cause you a bit of alarm. Like you stand up and pay attention and say, oh, hold on. So, because then, this is ayah, verse 5. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يُحَادُّونَ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ كُبِتُوا كَمَا كُبِتَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. Now here we're taken to those who يُحَادُّونَ Allah. Juxtaposed to this woman are people who in fact don't take, their frame of reference is not to go to Allah and the Prophet for a solution, but in fact seem to exist in hostility to, or in opposition to, Allah and the Prophet. And kubitu, the very expression that it's like they've been damned for. And so you perk up and you say, okay, so we're not talking about the woman and her husband, who are sort of a very different dynamic in terms of the problem of communication and what results from your communication and going to Allah and the Prophet and all of that. And Allah reminds us that with this constant refrain, that the day will come, فَيُنْبِئُهُمُ اللَّهُ بِمَا عَمَلُوا أَحْصَاهُ اللَّهُ وَنَسُوهُ, where indeed Allah will remind them of their deeds that they have forgotten, but Allah has not forgotten. Whenever you see a reminder in the Qur'an where Allah is telling you about deeds that you might forget, but Allah does not forget, you are immediately reminded of the Prophet's hadith, ﷺ, that there are things that human beings articulate or say that can plummet them in hell. They might take lightly, but indeed, for Allah, they are most serious. So in other words, put differently, the responsibility of speech, the responsibility of the discursive process. There are things, dynamics of talk. So, for instance, you might have someone that says all the time, alayya talaq bit-talata, swearing by God, divorce my wife 3 times. And he might swear on things that are violated. And by the discursive process, his wife is no longer his wife. But he never thinks about it, and he goes home and he resumes his relationship with his wife, never thinking about all the times that he said, he swore. Can you imagine the consequences in the hereafter? You've been living in haram for all these years. You took your speech very lightly. But the reality constructed by the speech is disastrous upon you. But here, what is Surah Al-Mujadilah alerting us to? So first, Allah reminds us of 2 things. One is that Allah doesn't forget. And that Allah understands the responsibility and the reality of your speech, understands what happens from your words. You might ignore it, you might be oblivious to it, but Allah is not oblivious to it. So that's one. But two, look, Allah reminds us that, listen, there is no najwa, and this is the first time that najwa now enters in the picture. There is no najwa that Allah is not a part of. There is no najwa. There are two people cannot talk without Allah being their third. Three people without Allah being their fourth. Five people without Allah. No, and no greater, no lesser. Allah is present. We often say, yeah, I know this. But do you really? Are you really fully conscious of Allah's presence? Every time you talk to your wife, every time you talk to your business partner, every time you talk to your children, in every conversation, Allah is thoroughly present in the speech. So what is the issue though with najwa? Okay. So first, this is in Ayah 7 that where Allah says, you engage in najwa, and I am reminding you that there is no najwa without Allah being there. But then in 8, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ نُهُوا عَنِ النَّجْوَى ثُمَّ يَعُودُونَ لِمَا نُهُوا عَنْهُ. So first, it tells us that they were told not to engage in najwa. And yet, they consistently violate this najwa. You first told that. Then, an elaboration. What is the form of najwa that they engage in? Well, the form of najwa that they engage in involves ithm wa idwan wa ma'siyat al-rasul. That it involves ism, sin, idwan, aggression, wa ma'siyat al-rasul, disobeying the Prophet ﷺ. Before we get even further elaboration about the hayuk, we pause because Allah is alerting us to the nature of najwa. Allah doesn't say immediately, they were banned from engaging in najwa that is sinful and aggressive and disobedient. No, Allah says they were forbidden from engaging in najwa, and then explains the characteristics of their najwa. That immediately alerts us to, okay, so what is najwa? And in what ways is najwa similar to or different from jidal? And najwa, the word itself, mushtaqqa, it's a word that comes from an-nujuwa. Nujuwa is anything that is elevated and raised. And so secretive talk is described as najwa because it has the element like elevated land or like mountainous areas. It's exclusive and inaccessible to the others. So what is the nature of najwa? Najwa is a type of speech that by its nature inaccessible or exclusive. When you say najaytullah, if you are doing it, if you are uttering a supplication in public where everyone can hear you, technically that's not a munajah. A munajah is something that you are uttering. If it's directed at Allah, at God, then it is not accessible, or that it has an element of inaccessibility. So what is the social problem that is taking place? Remember in Surah An-Nisa we talked about a lot about how the hypocrites, or those that are saying they are believers, they in fact count themselves among Muslims, but that they go and meet with Christians and Jews and are constantly engaging in a counter discourse to the prophetic project in Medina. They support, or they reaffirm the parties that did not convert to Islam, the Christians and Jews, and the Christian Jews are reaffirm them in turn. Now, what's fascinating is that in the reports, it tells us that this process of elements that identify themselves as Muslim going off in secret meetings or exclusive meetings, speaking with Christians and Jews who are considered outsiders to the Muslim Ummah, created anxiety among the Muslim community. It would often make them feel like it resulted in the spread of rumors. It resulted in the rumor mills often circulating of stories that about impending dangers, either confirmed or not confirmed. Or even the feeling that there might be conspiracies being woven against the Muslim community, or those who are in fact loyal to the Prophet ﷺ. And this behavior is deeply disturbing to the group that are not among the munafiqun. So they know that these people say that they're fellow Muslims, but they also know that these are the people who are constant critics of the reform, the laws that demand changes, and we've talked about that in Surah An-Nisa, and they constantly feel that what are these people up to? Does this mean that we should treat them as enemies, or should we treat them as Muslims? Do we trust them? Do we don't trust them? Now, pause here. There's a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that tells you if there are three people together, two people should not start speaking amongst themselves to the exclusion of the third, lest the third think that the conversation taking place is about that third person. I trust that all of you have heard this hadith at one point or another. And this hadith uses the word najwa, the expression najwa. The dynamic of najwa that the Qur'an is talking about here, al-mujadilah is honest. Al-mujadilah is you are being honest about why you are objecting to the law. And you are complaining to God. And the law must be responsive. And najwa is dishonest. This is the thing. Mujadilah actually turns out to be healthy. It's a healthy dynamic. The najwa is unhealthy because it has the element of treachery and secrecy and exclusiveness. It excludes people. It is a discourse, a way that creates factions and parties in society, that breaks the sense of transparency within society. So when there's a number of hadiths, I mean a considerable number, where some of them are like a hadith that has been described as actually da'if, or that the Prophet ﷺ hears people. He hears people outside his residence speaking. He comes out to them and he says, "What are you talking about?" And they say something. One narrative, one version says we were talking about Christ. Another narrative says, another version says we're talking about the moon. And he says, "Didn't I forbid you from engaging in najwa?" These are not the. I mean, these are the unreliable versions of, but. Clearly, if you take the all the versions together and you see what they articulate is a social anxiety about a dynamic. The text of the Qur'an itself points us to this social anxiety about this dynamic, as we'll see in a second, about the process in which, instead of there being a jidal, an open, honest conversation or debate or argument about the issues created by these legal changes, instead there is this air of secrecy and the possibility of subterfuge and undermining the law or the program of change through dishonest means. So this والعدوان ومعصية الرسول. So part of this وإذا حيوك بما لم يحيك به الله بما لم يحيك به الله, that this refers again to a specific, the report tells us that Jewish tribes, or the Jewish tribes, and some reports says also members of the Munafiqun, that they would say Assalamu alaikum. Instead of Assalamu alaikum, they take out the lam and alif, Assam alaikum, or the lam, Assam alaikum. Assam means death upon you, instead of peace upon you. And there are narratives from Aisha, again, one of the versions, for instance, that certain individuals passing by, and then they say to the Prophet ﷺ, Assam alaikum, and Assam alayk ya Abu Qasim. And Aisha hears that, catches that they said Assam and not Assalam, and that she responds to them, Wa alaykum assam wa la'natullah, and may Allah's sam, death, and God's curse be upon you. And then the Prophet ﷺ tells Aisha, Ya Aisha, inna Allah la yuhibbu al-fuhsh wa la al-mufhish, that Aisha, you shouldn't respond this way because Allah doesn't like obscenities, or those who say obscenities. And she said, Alam tasma'hum, didn't you hear what they just said? And the Prophet answers her, yes, I heard. And what I said is, wa alaykum. It's enough that I just said, and unto you whatever you said. So, in other words, there's no need to go to obscenities. So you have these traditions that tell us that part of the dynamic is, again, the dishonest use of language in, perhaps we can call it, non-transparent and non-accountable way, to make sneers and jeers and to sort of to stab, to create an environment of insecurity and anxiety and suspicion. Language can do that. If we don't use language responsibly and honestly, that's why where you find language often the most not straightforward, the most unstraightforward language is often in authoritarian societies. Authoritarian societies learn how to say what they want to say without saying it directly, indirectly. But that's part of najwa. That's part of the immorality of the process, is that if you don't learn to speak honestly and see, language creates reality. Language is not just an instrumentality that is neutral and safe. Language is a very dangerous weapon. You and it's like a gun. You can't, if you're very adept, you can shoot a gun where you want it to go. But most people are not skilled with language. Language requires a great deal of education and talent to be used with precision. But even if used with precision, if the recipient of the language is not equally skilled, well, it can produce all types of unintended consequences. So, okay. So we know that so many of the reports that are transmitted in the context of Surah Al-Mujadilah focus on the role of the munafiqun in having their own meetings, which, by the way, will culminate in Masjid al-Dirar. We haven't got into that incident yet. But an air of insecurity, the fact that they spread, that they talk about rumors, they indulge in quite a bit of rumors. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then comes and says, understand that if you are going to engage in the type of speech that is by its nature inaccessible to all, so it's not open forum speech, a speech that excludes parties, then فلا تتناجوا بالإثم والعدوان ومعصية الرسول وتناجوا بالبر والتقوى. So the only options is that you talk about bir and taqwa. But if your speech involves ithm, وعدوان, aggression, disobedience or undermining the Prophet ﷺ, because now look at this expression here in 10. إنما النجوى من الشيطان ليحزن الذين آمنوا. So najwa itself, why did it in 10, Allah doesn't tell us that it is that evil speech, but najwa itself, إنما النجوى من الشيطان, it doesn't mean that all najwa is demonic, but it means that the min ash-shaytan means the potentiality that it be demonic is there. When you engage in speech that is exclusive, that is inaccessible, and referring to the context that that I was just describing, لِيَحْزُنَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, so that it causes those who believe meaning those who are actually loyal and sincere with the Prophet ﷺ, a great deal of anxiety. What it's referring to is that the dynamic that I just described, that there are parties that engage in speech, whether amongst themselves or whether with Jewish tribes, as the traditions tell us, but this inaccessible speech that is engaged in underground, very different from Mujadilah, which creates a great deal of insecurity in society. If you must engage in it, then it must be in birr and taqwa. But Allah knows that in fact that's not what you talk about. And that the social effect of your najwa is what we've described. Okay. But Allah, of course, then assures Muslims, because this is a message also to Muslims, that, well, the anxiety that you feel, they can't hurt you unless Allah allows them to hurt you. Okay. Then we come to this most remarkable Quranic, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قيل لكم تفسحوا في المجالس فافسحوا يفسح الله لكم وإذا قيل لكم انشزوا فانشزوا يرفع الله الذين آمنوا منكم والذين أوتوا العلم درجات والله بما تعملون خبير. At this point, you get this message that if Allah says, let me see how this is 11, right? What time is it? Okay, Muhammad Asad just translates it. Make room for one another in your collective. Oh, wait. Muhammad Asad translates it. All you have attained to faith when you are told, make room for one another in your collective life. Do make room and return, and in return, God will make room for you in God's grace. The reason I paused and I got surprised is he says in your life, which is actually quite insightful of Muhammad Asad, because the traditions are often completely, they tell you things like that people were so eager to be close to the Prophet ﷺ, which I don't doubt that the ones who were sincere, but that they tell you that the occasion for revelation was that the those who took part in Badr came and they wanted to sit in the front rows, but the people who were later converts after Badr wouldn't make space, and so the people who took part in Badr, stood around disappointed that they couldn't sit close to the Prophet. And often then the way that you learn this, and definitely the way that I learned this, is that what this ayah is saying is that if someone comes late and wants a space, just move aside and give them space to sit. But this completely misses the point. Why right after Allah is talking about al-munajah? We started out with jadal, then we went to munajah, and then Allah starts talking about ifsah al-majalis, and as if it just makes space for people to sit. Right? You're rather stumped. Well, how does this all... Now, let's see if I copied this. I hope so. If not, I can find it. Yeah. Okay, so here's what Ar-Razi says, which I think he's right on. So he says, اعلم أن هذه الآية دلت على أن كل من وسع على عباد الله أبواب الخير والراحة وسع الله عليه خيرات الدنيا والآخرة، ولا ينبغي للعاقل أن يقيد الآية بالتفسح في المجلس، بل المراد منه إيصال الخير إلى المسلم وإدخال السرور إلى قلبه. That what Razi is saying is that what this ayah is talking about, it's not talking about making space. And in fact, he describes it as irrational to think that it's just talking about making space for people in majlis. But what it's saying is to open the doors of goodness. وسع على عباد الله أبواب الخير. That الإفساح في المجالس is the dynamic of both الإفساح تفسحوا في المجالس and your attitude is to embrace facility and ease and to open the venues and doors for goodness in all your social dynamics. And as Razi says, وَإِدْخَالِ السُّرُورِ فِي قَلْبِ, that to actually bring happiness to the hearts of people. So, pause here again. Look at the way the Prophet ﷺ, when Khawla tells him that her husband, who created the problem, he doesn't have the health to fast or the money to feed, or the story of the man with the strong sexual desire. Again, the way that the Prophet solves the problem is precisely like ifsah al-majalis. The attitude you should have, instead of the type of social dynamics in which you are creating suspicion, you are perhaps even entertaining yourself at the expense of people by creating an air of suspicion and treachery and backbiting and, betrayals and factionalism and, breaking, as in the dynamics of Najwa, this party and that party. Contrast this with al-ifsah fil majalis wal inshaz wal nushuz, that you are actually having an attitude of all is welcome, we are here to spread goodness and to solve your problems. Here Najwa, so when someone says, well, how does Najwa on birr and taqwa look like? So it means that if I if I have a secret conversation, we talk about our special code of salah, well, actually, or our special code of dhikr, well, actually, if your special code of dhikr is going to create a faction and the impression of a secret society and create a sense of division and suspicion in society, then no, it's not birr and taqwa. And it's not about birr and taqwa. It's not a conversation. Birr and taqwa is in Najwa. If you must have it, that it must pour into that moral principle of opening the doors of goodness. All is well, all are welcome. Our hearts and souls are open to all. The law itself must reflect that attitude, because remember that this surah starts out with a legal problem. If the law says, I am here to maintain hududullah, even if that means complicating and making the lives of people very difficult, then you failed. Al-ifsah fil majalis is understanding what hududullah are supposed to serve. And we, in the same way that the Prophet ﷺ upheld the principle of a kafara is necessary, but the moral lesson that the kafara is paid by Bayt al-Mal, if need be. So the point is not to torment people. The point is to reaffirm the morality, while at the same time al-ifsah fil majalis, opening the doors for goodness. Now, it is not an exaggeration to say that this ayah 11, إذا قيل لكم تفسحوا في المجالس, is itself an entire moral philosophy. If you truly understand what Surah Mujadilah is about, because if you create a society that is a closed society, anchored on the assumptions of privilege and exclusivity, VIP as opposed to non-VIP, Sada as opposed to the non-Sada, like wherever you go to Muslim societies, unfortunately, one of the things that bothered me enormously, do you know to get we've created societies, Muslim societies are profoundly hierarchical. Like if you are a nobody, you have no chance of meeting the bashawat or the higher ups. Even I don't want to digress. So even in the religious institutions, you know, the way that if you have access to meet Sheikh Al Azhar and you have access to meet a Mufti, and the way you're treated is as if you suddenly jump from a common human being to royalty, and it is such just contra the entire morality of the Quran. The ifsah al-majalis is an entire, it's this moral spirit of saying God's law is not here to complicate the lives of people. God's law is here to solve the problems of people. Okay. But then, look. Now, it says, وَإِذَا قِيلَ انشُزُوا فَانشُزُوا يرفع الله الذين آمنوا منكم والذين أوتوا العلم درجات. So, this reference, of course, I did forget one thing. I'll have to come back to it. I hope I don't forget. Okay. That first, let me say something about inshaz. And nashaz is when تنحي الشيء عن موضعه, is something to move from its actual or its proper place. That is why we say imra'a nashiz, for instance, that a woman that, of course, the technical meaning, as we've talked about, is sexual offense, but linguistically, al-mar'a al-mutanahhiya, that a woman that has broken or that has moved from whatever place, that's the linguistic. So when we say وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَكُمْ انشُزُوا, now of course you get reports that say that, well, this refers to that people would love to hang around the Prophet ﷺ, and they would be told, okay, disperse, and they wouldn't disperse because they just wanted to hang around the Prophet, and that, of course, we later on get a revelation that addresses the specific problem. But as Razi points out, that here, and the reference to a nushuz must be understood in the context, to the reference of ifsah al-majalis, means like where you say one shuzu, move out of your comfort zone, is the best way I can put it. That in the same way that ifsah al-majlis, in the same way that to truly open the doors of goodness, as Razi and others had put it. Also, you find that a lot of the Sufi tafsir, same thing was. It is you can't remain static and do that. Often it means moving out, away from التنحي عن المواضع المختارة or المواضع المعتادة, that you move beyond what you're comfortable with. Otherwise, if you're static, the nature of a society that relies on what comes to it, the path of least resistance. In other words, a society that is determined to create a moral order will challenge the dynamics of exclusivity. Will uproot, will say we want to create accountability and transparency, but that requires going out of your comfort zone, because the comfort zone is to rest on inherited privileges, inherited fractions. Listen, what is it that human beings normally gravitate to, right? Tribalism, clannishness, ethnic divisions that are comfortable to them, class divisions that are comfortable to them, family divisions that are comfortable to them. People tend to mix with their class. People tend to mix with people of their language. People tend to mix with people of their culture. People tend to mix with people of their race. They tend to mix with people of their ethnicity. Well, in order to challenge that, and you open al-ifsah al-majalis to actually open up the doors of goodness and the doors of inclusivity, then it requires nushuz, that you go out of your comfort zone. Because if it's just a comfort zone, it's going to be same old, same old. Now, the other thing is, so many of the Quranic commentaries pause at وَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمُ دَرَجَاتٍ, that Allah will elevate those who have true piety and true knowledge. And remember that when Allah speaks about men and women, Allah says that men, in accordance to their natural abilities and in accordance with their earning power or what money they bring in, they have over women what? A single daraja. Singular, not plural. Here it refers to plural darajat. So the comparison is stark, right? What does a single step mean compared to many steps? And here, the grammatical construction, because is it saying that if you succeed in this attitude of being open to goodness and inclusivity, which is al-ifsah fil majalis, is the heart of inclusivity. You're making space for others. Instead of munajah, instead of people having, little factions, you're saying, no, all come in. We're all one. Is it saying that if you do this, then you will have iman and ilm that will open the possibility for true iman and true ilm that is steps above? Or is it saying that those who have iman and ilm are especially positioned to achieve al-ifsah fil majalis and that open dynamic we're talking about? Now, of course, in the commentaries you read when they comment on ayah number 11, they're all discuss the ahadith about that العالم, that عالم, the ibadatul alim, that a person who worships and they're alim and they're a scholar, or they seek knowledge, that one day of worship is equal by them, is equal to 40 years of worship by ibadatul abid, that the worship of someone who is not a seeker of knowledge. And you find in the books of in the tafsir, in many reports about that, the value or the importance of this ayah in understanding ahamiyatul ilm, that the importance of seeking knowledge, and that most commentaries tend to take this to mean that in order to, in fact, fulfill the objective of al-ifsah fil majalis and nushuz fil ard, that you need to recognize the importance of ilm, and that the iman and ilm both, that the combination of two coming together, and that the alim, the importance of an alim, and because you often get the traditions in this context that which say, that scholars are the inheritors of prophets, and that between that the people who have the power of intercession and shafa'a in the hereafter will be prophets, martyrs, and scholars. A lot of these traditions, and I'm not challenging them or saying that they're not authentic or anything. I mean, the no tradition, even more than Judaism, has put an emphasis on the importance of seeking knowledge and the importance of society translating its reverence for those who seek knowledge. It's not enough that we tell people seek knowledge, but society itself doesn't revere those who seek knowledge. And absolutely, I believe that part of the problem is that when social values betray, we say we value our religion and we value our tradition and we value our sharia and we value this, but then our social values don't actually translate that into and this pathology produces all types of evils. But I think that the language itself, that Allah is telling us that if you adhere to the morality that the Qur'an is teaching you, part of this morality, you understand the way that God's law is supposed to work. You understand the importance of opening the doors of khair, of goodness. And you understand the importance of dynamism. And you understand the importance of honesty in the construction of, in speech, constructing reality, and the critical role of honesty in speech, that in turn, because in the same way that Allah helps those who help themselves, that in turn will mean that Allah will help those of you who have iman and who want to seek knowledge. So it's the entire gist of Surah Al-Mujadilah. It's a dynamic flow, in the same way that the woman starts out with a conversation with her husband, goes to the Prophet ﷺ, goes to Allah, and then Allah responds, and it's this dynamic process. You get the same type of energy from what the Qur'an says about the place of Iman and Ilm, both in inspiring al-ifsah fil majalis and opening the doors of goodness, and the effect of opening the doors, of the effect of this morality in turn nourishing and growing the process of Iman wal Ilm. That it is not, it goes both ways. The thing that I forgot was verse 8. Notice where it says, وَإِذَا جَاءُوكَ حَيُّوكَ بِمَا لَمْ يُحَيِّكَ بِهِ اللَّهُ وَيَقُولُونَ فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ لَوْلَا يُعَذِّبُنَا اللَّهُ بِمَا نَقُولُ. Here what they're saying is that so we talked about them saying Sam alaykum, meaning death unto you, Sam alaykum Abu Qasim. And of course, if you're again, it's using speech in a dishonest way, and you're anyway. But they were also then saying, well, why doesn't God knows that we're saying death unto you, not peace unto you. Why doesn't God punish us? Because why doesn't God curse us? It is easy to just read this, something like this, and say, oh, okay, yeah, fine. So, they're challenging the Prophet ﷺ and Allah. But look at, again, that type of attitude is actually something that is familiar to all of us, where you use God in human competitions as if God is a player with us. Well, if like, for instance, I often hear dictators in the Middle East say, well, if we were wrong, God wouldn't have helped us. The reason we're in power is because God is on our side. That way of exploiting, you don't know why God has allowed you to put people in prison or torture people or kill people. Do not use God in a way that reduces divinity to your petty human ends. Why God doesn't curse you and smite you because you are wishing death unto the Prophet, that is neither for you nor I to even think about. It's immaterial to the dynamics of thinking about what's right and what's wrong. Allah has Allah's purposes that you and I are not privy to. And we should never play that game because it just, if you pay attention and you're honest with yourself, you will see how often we do play this game. We take a reality, well, Allah must be okay with this because that's the reality that we've constructed as human beings. You can draw no such inference. Allah must want you to stay married to this person, or Allah must want you to have this, well, because it is. Well, no. You can't use that, especially when it comes to the social dynamics so the fact that they are trying to say that God didn't smite us, and so it must be that then we are not bad, and that in fact this can't be a truthful prophet. All of these are the imputing of, and this is exactly what the Quran criticizes the Israelites for doing, is that the reduction of divinity into these human endeavors. Um, what time is it? Oh, okay. It's after. It's 8:10. Is it? Are you guys still fasting? Who's fasting? Raise your hand. Two people. Haram. My apologies. But you've earned a lot of hasanat because of this, So it's okay. The rest of you who broke fast, no hasanat for you. Okay, well, inshallah, we'll finish Surah Al-Mujadilah next week. Let's stop here and we'll complete it next week, inshallah. Okay. Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum. Oh, wait. She has to close the proceedings. I just want to, Inna Allahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. Our friend Cameron Lee, Grace posted an interview with him. He's a cancer patient where he discusses his thoughts about life and death, and his doctors had given him a month to live after his cancer returned, and
his liver failed.
Inna Allahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. Just wanted to say that we're very sorry that Cameron Lee has passed away, and please make dua for him and for his family. May Allah accept your dua, and may Allah ease their pain, and may Allah forgive him and grant him Jannah, inshallah, ya Rabbil Alameen. We miss him. Cameron visited us in Los Angeles several times, and I spoke to him on the phone just days before he passed away, and we miss him, and please remember him in your dua. He will be sorely missed.
Do you want to find your thing?
Yeah.
So, alhamdulillah, if you didn't have a chance to watch it, it was a really lovely conversation, and sure enough, it was on March 6th, and he passed on April 1st, which was the first night of Ramadan. So it really truly was like a month, and I feel so grateful that I had a chance to have that conversation. What was really touching is after he passed, well, I was like trying to I was texting with him, and I hadn't heard from him since like March 24th, and then it was now about April 8th or 9th, and I had like one friend of his whose phone number I had that the Cameron had given me. So I called him because I just said, I've been trying to reach Cameron and I haven't heard from him, and then he gave me the news, and it was really interesting because his friend thanked me and said, please tell the Sheikh, that he's had a profound impact on Cameron, because after he converted, he was just so much more at peace, and it made such a difference in his life. This was a friend of his from I think childhood, from a very long time, and he said that his parents actually, I didn't know this from our conversation. We talked about whether his parents knew that he was Muslim, and he said yes, that his parents knew and that they were supportive. But I actually had the impression that his parents had known for several years, because he had been Muslim for 4 years. But the truth is that I found out that they had just found out in the last few months, and that this was sort of an area of his life that they didn't know much about. Like, they felt like this was something that just, they just didn't understand or know. And they didn't know that I had had this conversation with him. So he was really happy that I shared that with him, and he shared it with with Cameron's parents. I haven't had a chance to reach out and talk to them. I wanted to give them a little bit of time, but it struck me like if I feel like this was such a blessing, because if I had lost my son and I didn't really understand like this really important part of his life and how he came to Islam and what it meant to him and how he felt about it, and then all of a sudden I got this hour-long video where he's talking about it, and he's been now departed from the world for about a week or two. That would have been an incredible gift for me as a mom, or as a parent. And so I felt really like just so happy to have been able to have that conversation and give them that link. And they were, and I know his friend told me that his parents were really excited to watch it. So so that was truly a gift. And and I think if you watched it, what was amazing is there's a portion where he talks about this dream that he had about dying, and how the angels came to visit him and pulled his soul out of his body, and how it was euphoric. And so that was something that, well, actually, and let me add to that too, that the angels walked with him, or, he had to go and confront his misdeeds, and was like walked through this museum where he actually saw like his misdeeds, and he knew that the angels were with him and like reassured him that you've been forgiven, but nonetheless you still have to see what your misdeeds were. And he had the feeling like, okay, they assured him, you're only going to be here for a short time as you're walking through this portion of hell. And that he looked over and he said, for lack of a better word, sort of these prison cells that were for people that were not so lucky that they wouldn't just pass through quickly. And so this was like obviously a very powerful dream, and it was really striking because it was very similar to what we learned in Surah Jathia, in Project Illumine. So, but alhamdulillah, that dream reassured him that it was, that he would be. If he said if this is what it was like, then I'm not scared, and so, and we know that that's something, it didn't feel like a dream, it felt like something more than that, and and Sheikh felt that was a message. So for that gave me a lot of calm and reassurance that he's definitely in a better place. He alhamdulillah, when he passed, I understand that it was very fast, and that it was as best as it could have been. He was with his family and all of that. So, I'm really happy to hear all of that, alhamdulillah. So please pray for him. And, he was, he was really special. And alhamdulillah, he found out about Sheikh when he was in high school, and had found a feature about him in the LA Times, where it talked about how a lot of Sheikh's writings had been banned in Saudi Arabia. And he said to himself, well, anyone whose writings have been banned in Saudi Arabia, I want to read this guy. So that's kind of how he found Sheikh, and then eventually converted. So it's a really interesting story. He talks about it. So anyway, I encourage you to watch it. So I guess I didn't realize we were going to finish so soon, so I didn't prepare anything. But I thought what was very interesting is when I started to read, again, as I often do, I will look at the one paragraph introduction. This is to this chapter in the Abdul Halim translation. And in this translation, this chapter is called The Dispute. And this is how it's described. A Medinan surah which disallows a specific pagan divorce practice. The surah takes its title from the dispute referred to in verse 1 between a wife who had been divorced in this manner and the Prophet. The surah supports the woman. It goes on to state that those who oppose God and his messenger, who secretly ally themselves with Satan, who lie in their oaths and make intrigues against the Prophet, will be defeated and suffer humiliation, both in this world and in the next, while those on God's side will triumph. And that's it. And it's always so interesting just to see like what we get and then what, is presented as like the summary of the surah. So alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Thank you so much for this amazing first half of Surah Mujadilah. I'm so excited to hear the rest of it. Thank you for being with us. And we're halfway through Ramadan, so it's unbelievable how quickly time passes. But inshallah, have a wonderful rest of the week, and we will look forward to seeing you guys a week from today. Assalamu alaikum.